では、続きまして、スコット・フィッシャー先生による、レクチャー1ですが、The History and Potential of XR for Human-Robot Interaction and Remote Presence Applications と題しまして、ご講演をいただきたいと思います。We welcome Scott Fisher. Please come up and have your presentation. はい。
My work in this area has been over the course of more than 45 years in a number of different capabilities, starting as a research fellow at MIT Center for Advanced Visual Studies in the 70s, working later as a research scientist at MIT, Atari, and the NASA Ames Research Center in Northern California. And then, based on the work at NASA, developing a startup, before startup was actually a word, in a company called Telepresence Research, also in Northern California. And then since the turn of the century, mostly coming back to academic research to focus on some of the more blue sky research that we weren't able to do in a corporate setting. So almost everything that I've been involved in my career has been around making three-dimensional imaging, immersive technology, building experiences and images that you can step inside of. So earlier in the 1950s and early 60s, 3D movies, 3D comic books, and other forms of 3D drawing, etc., were very popular. And eventually I ended up developing more technology to make this experience possible. Okay, so in terms of the history of VR, there are many different timelines. It's still very early in the development of this new medium, so not everyone is in agreement with what the key projects were, what the key elements were that contributed to what we have now. Here's one chart that I think is a pretty good representation of some of the key projects starting in the mid-1950s. So I'll talk about a number of these just to give a sense of the kind of trajectory of how research gets out of the research lab into a commercial product. This is something that I find my students have very difficult, a lot of difficulty understanding. Most of them think VR was developed in 2019 or 2020, so fairly recently. One of the things that's also a bit of a problem in developing a new medium is what are the terms we call it by. And unfortunately, there have been so many different terms that VR has come to be known by that it gets a little confusing. So starting back in the 80s, I think the preferred term was virtual environments. Some people called it artificial reality. Virtual reality, or VR, came a little bit later and was picked up by the popular press, and that's what ended up being most used. Cyberspace was another one used in science fiction writing, and synthetic environments was what groups like the US government used. At the same time, we had other terms referring to a kind of similar experience, like remote presence, teleexistence, a term developed by Professor Tachi here in Japan in the 1980s, and telesymbiosis, a term used in France also in the 80s and later in the 90s. More recently, you've probably heard mixed reality, extended reality, merged reality. Most of these have been developed by corporations developing the specific product. And then currently, I think the main term that we hear most often is XR. And for a while, we heard the term metaverse, but we'll come back to that a number of times. Okay. Sorry for these very wordy charts, but I think it's important to understand how these concepts and technologies developed and how people thought of them, what they called them. So this is a very updated terminology chart done by Avi Bar-Ziv in 2022. So we still see the term artificial reality, virtual reality, and others. What I want to do today, though, is focus on one term in particular called telepresence. So this was a term actually coined by a scholar named Patrick Gunkel and used by Marvin Minsky and myself throughout the 80s to refer to this experience of being immersed in a virtual environment. So Minsky is a name that you probably are familiar with. He's a professor at MIT. He was very involved with robotics, but he's probably best known for his pioneering efforts in artificial intelligence. Marvin was working at a time when robots were starting to be used for what was called teleoperation, dealing with hazardous substances in nuclear plants, in space-based operations, and things like that. So early examples of teleoperation were human-machine interfaces to control the remote robots. So very interesting configurations mechanically, but also kind of very heavy and very awkward to use. So not that human-friendly. In working with those technologies, Minsky was inspired to think about how could it be better? How could we make this interface and this activity easier for humans? So in 1979, he wrote a memo at MIT called Toward a Remotely Manned Energy and Production Economy, where he imagined this idea of almost all work being done remotely, much as we're talking about today with cyber avatars and cyber physical society. What Marvin described was a scenario where people would actually wear a jacket with sensors and muscle-like motors, controlling remote mechanical hands. Everything is instrumented with sensors. And in this scenario, you could work in another room, another city, or another country. So very much, again, what we're talking about today. He called this, again, telepresence. And the idea was that they feel and work like our own hands. He proposed that this would take 20 years and cost $1 billion, but that it would repay itself 100-fold. In that report, he also cited a number of science fiction authors, many of whom he knew. This one in particular, Robert Heinlein, wrote a very well-known story called Waldo, where an operator like this, who happened to be disabled, could control remote robots like this back on the Earth from low Earth orbit. About a year later, Marvin wrote a new version of this report in the Popular Press in Omni magazine, and he called it Telepresence, a manifesto. So in this, he says very specifically, telepresence is not science fiction. We could have a remote-controlled economy by the 21st century if we start planning right now. So that's what he did. And here we are now talking about this remote-controlled economy. A couple years later, he had already procured funding for developing some of these early telepresence systems for the US space program. You can see here, and these manipulators, remote camera systems, somewhat anthropomorphic structure for the robots. Okay, so let's talk specifically about this idea of presence. I think it's probably familiar to everyone. So it's the idea is to give this sense of being somewhere other than where you are. A strong enough sensory feedback to make you feel like you're in a particular location. So then telepresence would mean a medium through which people can physically and emotionally experience remote or virtual places. In a sense, then, presence is the illusion of no mediation, of not having any technology between you and what you're experiencing around you. So with that in mind, I want to explore a number of examples of what we call technologies of presence, attempts to provide a mediated version of presence, to give someone the sense of being in a remote location. So obviously in the 19th century, with the development of motion pictures, there was a lot of interest in how you would transport someone to another location. So this was used for, it was envisioned mostly for things like telecommunication, but also very much in the area of entertainment, with experiments in making life-size motion pictures, and even early experiments to generate other kinds of sensory input from a distance. One of the first examples I could find of a telepresence robotic system is this comic from 1930. This is a Buck Rogers story where an operator is flying around controlling a remote robot on the ground. Also around late 19th century and early 20th century, we saw a lot of developments of panoramas, like literally putting someone inside a very large painting. In this case, this example is a life-size ship. This is a large painting that's over 1 kilometer long that unrolls as the ship is actually moving. So again, it's a kind of simulation of being on a ship going down a river. A little bit later, we're jumping to the 1950s now, we started seeing motion picture technology starting to imitate early panoramas. So motion pictures were typically just on a flat screen, but when television was introduced in the 50s, motion picture studios tried to find other ways to keep people continuing to come to their theaters. So Cinerama was one development using multiple screens and a very wide field of view to immerse the audience in the cinematic experience. This guy is named Mort Heilig. in 1952, he went to visit a Cinerama show. Mort was a documentary filmmaker, and he got very excited about Cinerama, but also started thinking, how could we make this better? How could we make this more immersive? Mort went on to develop something called the Sensorama. So this is a multi-sensory experience with 3D vision. The chair is actually a motion platform. It's color. It has a chemical smell bank to give you some olfactory experience of the environment that you're exploring. It has wind and vibration. He tried for many years to interest the studios in Hollywood in this particular new technology and was unsuccessful. But he went on to develop what he called experience theaters, and he also developed the first prototype of what looks very much like the VR headsets that we use today. And he got patents on that in the early 1960s. So Mort was a kind of key figure in thinking about how could we immerse an audience more deeply into a virtual experience. But unfortunately, no one was interested in the 50s or 60s when he was doing this work. So he ended up giving up and ran another kind of shop for the rest of his life. Fortunately, I was able to meet him, and when he passed away, he gave us all the original Sensorama equipment, and we're slowly restoring this. And we've also made virtual versions of the experiences that you were able to participate in the original version. Okay, so Mort Heilig, first example really of a kind of early telepresence system. Another important figure in this trajectory to commercial product is Ivan Sutherland, an academic researcher who originally came from MIT, worked in the US government, overseeing research funding. In 1965, Ivan wrote a very short paper called The Ultimate Display. And in this paper, he talked about how you could go within a virtual room and the computer would control everything in that room. You could sit in a chair and you could fire a gun, things like that. So a few years later, he experienced this project, another research project by Ford Philco Corporation that used a remote camera connected to a single monoscopic television display for the operator. When he moves his head, the remote camera moves. So Sutherland was impressed by this, but he thought, why not substitute computer graphics for the camera? And in fact, Sutherland had developed the first computer graphic system at MIT for his PhD dissertation. This is how Sutherland's system worked. You can see the user moving around. There are television displays for each eye. In this case, they're seeing a very simple graphic image superimposed onto the space around them. So this is the first augmented reality display. Okay, so Mort Heilig, Ivan Sutherland, another important figure in the early days of telepresence is Professor Susumu Tachi here at University of Tokyo in the 1980s. Here's a quick example of his work in this area. Okay, around the same time, I started working on a couple different projects, again, to develop this sense of telepresence. This one was called viewpoint-dependent imaging, using head tracking, magnetic head tracking, and hand tracking to turn a monitor into a virtual space that you could look into and get motion parallax from. That work eventually turned into work that I was able to do at NASA's Ames Research Center in 1985 with a small team of programmers and developers. Most of this work was for the space station being developed at the time for the US space program. Over the course of several years, we were able to build different displays for head-mounted imagery. This is a very low-resolution first version. This is 640 by 320 resolution, and then a little bit higher color display later. You can also see these gloves that we had built to be able to interact with virtual objects in that virtual space. So this is the first integrated VR system where you're completely enclosed in a virtual environment. One of the applications for space station was being able to control a remote robot, essentially seeing through the cameras built into the robot head. So we built a number of prototypes of remote robot camera systems that the user could control. So here's...
The operator's hardware consists of a head-mounted unit with wide-angle stereoscopic display screens. Magnetic sensors determine the relative position of the headset. The images can come from a database of existing or synthetic models, or the output of a remote source, such as a television camera atop a robot. NASA expects the personal simulator to make reality more accessible to space travelers, as in the manipulation of this remotely operated robot arm. Project director Scott Fisher calls it telepresence, or a virtual environment workstation. By wearing a glove with fiber optic sensors, the operator of this robot arm can couple his movements to those of the robot. To achieve precise control, telepresence includes voice commands and audible response, using both synthetic speech and sound effects.
Both robots' translation scale at 1/3.
Okay, so that, again, was very early effort in terms of technology. Computer graphics was still very low resolution and not necessarily real time. So we had to build all this hardware from scratch. Other applications that we looked into and started to prototype were medical applications like surgical simulation or even remote surgery that might be required for an astronaut on board the space station where a doctor was not available. Here's a little bit later version of the remote camera system that was actually built for Matsushita Denki in Osaka. Oops. Come on. So in this case, the remote camera moves very much in sync with the operator's movement of the display. So Matsushita's interest was using this in a showroom for having customers be able to visit their product showrooms from remote locations. Okay. All right. So that gets us to the beginning of the 1990s. And a very interesting thing happened about that time. I think a lot of the research work, not only in our lab, but in many other labs around the world, started to inspire Hollywood and the popular press and many writers. So we started to see a lot of examples of kind of futuristic scenarios of VR and telepresence experiences. Some of them pretty interesting, most of them pretty dark, pretty negative about how this new medium could be used. But nevertheless, it was a way for the general public to learn about this new technology. A little bit later, we started seeing movies about very specific cyber avatar scenarios. So Avatar, of course, is probably the most famous by James Cameron. But there's another one named Sleep Dealer by Alex Rivera, done around the same time as Avatar, that is a little bit darker scenario of how telepresence might be used in a kind of cyber physical economy. Here's a trailer. Okay, so the story there was the borders had been closed. What originally would be migrant workers had to work remotely between Mexico and the US. I think maybe we can talk more about that in the panel session later. Okay, so around this time, VR did not have a specific product that was publicly available. Typically, these systems were still extremely expensive. So a lot of popular press accounts said that VR was dead around 2010, 2011. In one of our labs at USC, we decided to develop a specific strategy to try to answer this problem. So what we did was develop a number of prototypes for low-cost VR. So these are 3D printed viewers that you could put your phone in or your tablet in. Here's actually a cardboard version of this that you could put your phone in. We started looking at using very high resolution display screens from mobile phones that were just becoming available to make higher resolution headsets at lower cost, and so on. So I won't go into all the developments. Oh, sorry. I won't go into all the developments. But the end effect was that I think we were successful in inspiring a number of companies like Samsung and Oculus and even Google to take those designs that we made publicly available and develop next step versions of them. So in fact, the founder of Oculus worked in that lab and then went off to start Oculus after that. Okay, so this is about 2014. Soon after that, we saw commercial products from HTC, from Oculus, and from Sony. So all of a sudden now the market, the commercial availability for these was much more available. Whoa. And now currently we have a version of the headsets that's about $300, fairly low cost consumer product. So again, there have been a wide variety of research efforts to develop head-mounted displays. I've shown a few examples of them. Many of them are long gone. Some of them have made the commercial success. But around this time, we also saw a slightly different direction emerge in a different form factor. And this is, again, very much more specifically around a kind of avatar scenario. Here's a project we did in 2015 using Google Glass, where a classroom of students could send directions to a remote human avatar and ask them questions, tell them to explore, look over here, go over there, talk to that person. Similar things from a German group in 2000, where this kind of avatar is carried on someone's back. Project here at Keio University in 2018 with a kind of avatar also mounted on your back, controlled by somebody remotely. And then another one called Teleactor from Berkeley in 2001. Okay, so I find this an interesting direction of now the idea of telepresence taking the form of a physical robot that you can control. So I think you're all familiar with systems like the Double and many others out there. Just some interesting anecdotes about how these were used. I mean, people started thinking about how they could actually use them while standing in line to buy a new iPhone at the Apple Store in Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto. Toyota developed an interesting system for to make access more available for people to the 2000 Olympics. For me, making this image life-size is a really interesting development. And then here's another one that Microsoft developed, trying to give a face to those telepresence robots, or actually a full body. Okay. All right. So now, more recently, we're back to Dr. Tachi's research in making some of his robots now commercially available. For example, this one was being used to restock shelves in the convenies here in Tokyo during COVID quarantine. Okay, so now I want to finish up with probably more of a question. As I said, around 2015, when we started seeing commercial product from Oculus and Sony and others, all of a sudden we saw a lot more very positive press about VR. So the New York Times headline was, "Virtual reality fails its way to success. For decades, VR was a complete flop, but now the Oculus Rift, it may be a total win." Another article, "Why VR will succeed this time around." I think they're mostly talking about comfort, low cost, of course, and easy availability. If you're familiar with Gartner, you probably know that they're probably one of the best known companies for tracking emerging technology trends. It's a market research company that tries to give other companies a sense of when new mediums, new technologies will make it into public awareness and public consumption. So this curve that they've developed goes through early innovation to inflated expectation to a kind of period of disillusionment when it doesn't perform the way people expect it to perform, to a kind of what they call slope of enlightenment, when it's like, this is how we can use it, to a plateau of productivity where it's actually in use. So I picked a few here. This is from 2017, where augmented reality is kind of fallen into this period of disillusionment. It had a lot of expectations, but now people are not sold on this. Virtual reality is finally making it into a number of application areas. A year later, VR is completely gone. So they left it off because it's being used in so many areas. Augmented reality is still stuck in this period of disillusionment, but now we start to see mixed reality, which is a kind of applied version of AR. AR was things like Google Glass, just notification systems. Mixed reality actually connects the virtual and the physical. By 2023, all of those are off the chart. So according to Gartner, these are now in use and fully accepted by the public. So how did that happen? In 23, in 21, we started hearing this term, the metaverse. And it was originally coined in 1992 by Neil Stephenson in his science fiction novel Snow Crash, but it described a kind of experience that combined virtual shared space and physical reality. Anyway, that's in 2021, in Google searches, the number of searches for metaverse increased immediately by tenfold when Facebook changed their name to Meta and declared they were going to be the metaverse company. So an interesting trigger for people, the general public, to now think about, what does the metaverse involve? Like, how does it affect me? So I'll come back to that later, but this is the original roadmap for metaverse back in 2007. And I just want to point out that it's not only about virtual worlds and VR. It includes VR and AR, and it includes life logging and mirror worlds. So life logging is tracking of what users do. And it can also be tracking of data about our physical environment. Mirror worlds is now something that we call digital twins. So that's another important part of this. So virtual simulations of physical objects that are run or driven by real-time data. So I think we can maybe come back to this as well later. But I think that's an important combination of media technologies to be aware of. Okay, so finally, here we are in 2024. Last year, the Apple Vision Pro was announced. Very expensive, but absolutely incredible technology in terms of the performance of the headset. So, so being able to generate very high resolution avatars of other users that you might be interacting with in a virtual or mixed reality space like this. But in spite of the technology improvements, way beyond other systems that we have commercially available, the press is still very negative about this new development. So here's an article from Wired magazine that says the Vision Pro was a misstep, a mistake. And now they have to catch up with smart glasses, which is a new form of a kind of technology to enable our metaverse experiences. So that kind of press coverage, that kind of negativity leaves me to ask this question. In fact, this was another article that came out about VR. What does success look like? Like, how do we measure whether it's a successful technology? So a lot of people will respond that it's the number of units sold. Is it a successful product? I would say it's probably more about what does it help us do better? What kind of applications can it contribute to? So again, I think maybe we can talk more about this on our panel discussion, but I find this a kind of interesting and somewhat disturbing, difficult question. Like, the press influences very strongly how we accept or reject these new media. And it's not clear if there are other venues to make this stuff more acceptable to the general public. So anyway, I will stop there, and we can discuss that a little bit later. Okay, thank you.
はい、スコット・フィッシャー先生、どうもありがとうございました。